Hey, welcome back everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment in Queens, New York, and we're continuing these broadcasts Monday through Friday, 5 days a week on this new coronavirus, this CCP virus. We're going to be starting off by going into how this virus, once everything is said and done, could have remade global supply chains and global manufacturing. We're going to be looking into the war of perception now being waged, and not just between the US and China. Also going to be going into how the Chinese regime is currently fighting back against calls for investigations into the origins of this virus. Now, folks, before we get started, if you haven't already, please do not forget to like and subscribe. Again, it really helps this channel grow. And also, we have a lot of folks asking us what they can do to help. There are two things. One, the Epoch Times has launched a global petition calling for the investigation, condemnation, and rejection of the Chinese Communist Party. If you want to sign that, go to ccpvirustruth.com. And we're asking people if they really want to help, sign it and then tell 5 more people about it. Also, we do accept donations on this channel. I understand it's rough times, of course. And so even, again, just liking, subscribing, telling your friends and family about this show, again, we really appreciate it. Now, jumping into it, there is a global movement, it seems to be taking place right now, of different countries pulling manufacturing out of China and even giving financial incentives to companies that do so. First off, there's a story in the Bangkok Post saying Japan to help shift output to ASEAN from China. We went into this a bit before, but we'll go over it again. Japan launched a 23.5 billion yen, that's $220 million, subsidy program to shift production out of China and into Southeast Asia. The initiative came after many automakers and other manufacturers suffered a shortage of parts produced in China after the new coronavirus outbreak started late last year in the central Chinese city of Wuhan. Not just surface manufacturing, but the fundamental manufacturing, the supply chains. Going further, South China Morning Post is reporting India luring firms fleeing China with land, offering nearly double the size of Luxembourg. It says, quote, India is planning to set aside 461,589 hectares of land across the country to entice foreign firms looking to exit China, sources say. And another one, India looks to lure more than 1,000 U.S. companies out of China. Of course, the U.S. has also been pulling, on their own more so, a lot of companies have been pulling out of China, given the fact that right now the whole place is on lockdown, they can't manufacture. The whole thing's shut down for the most part. Opening up slowly, but according to local reports, it's hard for them to find workers, hard for them to get to where they need to go, and also hard for them to fill orders. And so right now where things are destabilized, companies are pulling out. And even before this whole thing, they were pulling out already. 2 factors in that. One is the U.S.-China trade war. Going forward, if these investigations into the Chinese regime take place, which we'll be going into more so later in the show, Trump is talking about, for example, putting more tariffs on Chinese goods.
Well, I can do it differently. I can do the same thing, but even for more money just by putting on tariffs.
And of course, you can expect the Chinese regime to fight back with that. And so companies have been and still are pulling out of China. And it seems India is trying to entice them to move their businesses to India. Now, we've reported before that the Trump administration was talking about pulling the manufacturing of this personal protective equipment out of China. In other words, this protective gear for frontline medical workers and also these protective masks out of China. And we're now seeing the first steps of this. The FDA has pulled approval for dozens of mask makers in China. And in addition to this, speaking of India, India has now become the world's second largest PPE kit producer in just 2 months, and has also developed the world's first reusable PPE suit. Now, in addition to this, the Trump administration is pushing to rip global supply chains from China, according to officials reported by Reuters. And it's reporting, quote, the Trump administration is turbocharging an initiative to remove global industrial supply chains from China as it weighs new tariffs to punish Beijing for its handling of the coronavirus outbreak, according to officials familiar with U.S. planning. We've seen hopefully enough of unnamed sources getting proved false over the years to know you should not take everything at face value. But Trump has also been talking about this openly, so I think this is a credible report. It's interesting because right now what we're seeing is really the US-China trade war, on steroids. It is the US-China trade war being amplified by this virus. And now we have Reuters also reporting, back on the note of this personal protective equipment, that, quote, Trump orders to buy US-made medical supplies coming soon. That's according to Peter Navarro, one of Trump's top advisors on China. And so what does this show us? We're looking at a future where goods are no longer being manufactured in large scale inside China. We're looking at a future where a lot of Chinese high-tech companies have been sanctioned. And so we're looking at a future, in other words, where we're no longer reliant on the Chinese regime for our supply chains. And of course, a lot of the Chinese regime's pushes for soft power, for foreign influence, for all the underhanded systems of ideological subversion, at least a lot of them, are based around financial interest and the offerings of business opportunities. We could very likely see the Chinese regime's programs for, say, economic theft get derailed pretty heavily by this, at least when it comes to the Chinese regime selling to countries that will abide by U.S. tariffs. Of course, it can still seed black markets and such with knockoff goods, but that's not enough to really keep an entire economy afloat, even for North Korea, which does that. They still depend very heavily on the Chinese regime and a bit on Russia, basically to stay afloat. It's not likely the Chinese regime is going to be able to weather that. The Chinese regime, as where it currently is, still depends on foreign manufacturing coming into China. And so losing that suddenly means a lot of Chinese out of work. It means the Chinese economy fully destabilized, at least to a very significant extent. It means the high-tech pushes, which have been the Chinese regime's main focus, through things like China 2025, before that Project 863, state-directed programs directing the catching up fast and surpassing the West in the high-tech spaces. All of that could very soon end, depending on how this unfolds. And of course, even when it comes to the real high-tech stuff, smartphones, computers, in terms of consumer goods at least. And so we're very likely looking at a near future where China is no longer the world's manufacturing hub. We're looking at a near future where the Chinese regime's programs for industrial theft serve only internal markets and black markets. Looking at a possible future where there's mass unemployment in China as well, and also possibly an employment boom in other countries such as India, such as maybe Mexico, maybe even bringing manufacturing back to the US. Regardless, the landscape right now is in the process of shifting. Everything we once knew when it comes to manufacturing in China, which has been really the backbone of the global marketplace for the last at least more than a decade, all of that's about to change. Moving on to this war of perception. Trump is now saying that the coronavirus has been worse than Pearl Harbor.
The worst attack we've ever had on our country. This is really the worst attack we've ever had. This is worse than Pearl Harbor. This is worse than the World Trade Center. There's never been an attack like this.
And he's describing it as an attack on the United States that should have been stopped at its source.
And it should have never happened. Could have been stopped at the source. Could have been stopped in China.
In addition to this, in terms of this war of perceptions, U.S. lawmakers are pushing to name the Chinese embassy street after the coronavirus whistleblower doctor, Dr. Li Wenliang, who of course tried warning the world about this virus fairly early on, was stopped by the CCP, jailed, and of course later died of the coronavirus. He's being seen as a symbolic figure, almost a martyr in China and in a lot of other countries right now. In addition to this, China is warning the United Kingdom against a, quote, new Cold War, as it accuses British politicians of poisoning relations with Beijing. Liu Xiaoming, Beijing's ambassador to the UK, said in a webinar, regrettably, a few politicians in the UK have been addicted to the Cold War mentality to compare China to the former Soviet Union and urge a review of the China-UK relationship and even call for a new Cold War. Now, when the Chinese regime accuses others of calling for a new Cold War, it is introducing that concept into their minds that criticizing the Chinese regime, that going after the Chinese regime, criticizing its handling of the virus, is equivalent to engaging in a new Cold War with China. And moving on with this too, Beijing is demanding praise in exchange for medical goods, these medical supplies. Now, this was, of course, reported a little bit before. We covered it a bit, but now it's hitting the main headlines again. A growing number of reports indicate Chinese officials pushed their counterparts in Europe to make positive statements about China in order to receive shipments of medical supplies to fight the novel coronavirus. And this actually brings up an interesting question as to which politicians gave positive statements on the for the CCP on its handling of the virus in exchange for medical goods. In other words, which statements were made publicly defending the Chinese regime, promoting the Chinese regime in a time when it's being called out for mishandling this virus early on, for censoring, for disappearing journalists, lying to the world, lying to the WHO, which then repeated a lot of its lies, specifically around, for example, human-to-human transmission, specifically around delays on, say, travel restrictions, and even criticisms of countries like the US that put early travel restrictions on China. Now, when it comes to this war of perception, it can't be emphasized how big of a deal this is when it comes to perception management, when it comes to maintaining national security, when it comes to the Chinese regime maintaining internal stability. In free countries, democratic republics, democracies, whatever you want to call them, where you are depending on an educated public making informed decisions. Their exposure to information determines the decisions they make. In other words, the direction of free societies is based on the information they've been exposed to. And of course, their perceptions of what is good, what is bad, who is right, who is wrong, is again shaped by the information they're exposed to. This is why many countries, especially totalitarian regimes like the Chinese regime, manipulate media and information so, I'd say, intensively to such a minute degree where even, say, online comments are managed and censored. Pulling something into this now, actually, if you haven't read it, Edward Bernays' Propaganda has an interesting quote on this. This is written in 1928 and is considered one of the foundations of modern advertising, and also played a huge role in a lot of the information war campaigns we've seen throughout the 20th century. Now, right from the beginning, this is what he says: "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society." I won't go on with this, but Edward Bernays' Propaganda in 1928, the backbone of a lot of political propaganda campaigns, historical propaganda campaigns, even World War II, even the Cold War, matter of fact, and of course adopted pretty widely, I'd say, into a lot of perception management campaigns being used not just in the US but around the world these days. I won't go too far into this. The whole issue of perception management and the war of words is big, especially for the Chinese regime, where they've adopted things like the three warfares focused on information warfare into their military code. It's part of their military strategy. The CCP is fighting back against pushes for investigations into the origin of the virus. And they, of course, this has been going back and forth for a bit, but they're stepping it up a bit more now. Now, the Chinese regime, according to Financial Express, has dared Mike Pompeo to show, quote, enormous evidence of COVID-19 originating from a Wuhan laboratory. And coming back at this, China will bar international investigators until, quote, final victory, end quote, over pandemic is achieved. And that's according to Yahoo News. And so, in other words, the Chinese regime is daring Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, to prove, allegedly without a doubt, that the virus came from one of these Wuhan laboratories, and is at the same time barring international investigators from going to this laboratory to prove it. And so this is a very subtle propaganda tactic, again, a play on words, making it appear that Mike Pompeo is making statements that can't be, fully backed. Of course, a lot of times when you're dealing with government information, they're looking at expert analysis, military analysis, intelligence, even newspapers, public reporting, and of course investigating what they can verify, what they can't verify, and then basing their analysis on that. The U.S. right now, and Pompeo particularly, and Trump, are calling for investigations into that laboratory.
China is still refusing to share the information we need to keep people safe, such as viral isolates, clinical specimens, and details about the many COVID-19 patients in December 2019, not to mention patient zero.
And of course, in order to fully prove it, as the Chinese regime is now demanding, they need to get into that laboratory. And the Chinese regime, as the Yahoo is now reporting, will bar international investigators until final victory over pandemic is achieved. And final victory for the Chinese regime could be an indefinite thing. This is one of the things they can do. They can say whatever they want while they're being pressured. You might have seen this documentary Epoch Times recently released called The China Method, where we break down the 3 basic steps the Chinese regime often follows when it comes to influence campaigns, when it comes to pushing its interests. The first step is the play on words. The first step is the promise. The first step is the saying that they will do something, the signing of a paper, the signing of an agreement, the passing of something, make a claim that they will follow through on something. The next one is they manipulate that opening that has been formed and use it to their full extent. And then finally, they, of course, violate that agreement, violate that promise openly. And once they control the entire infrastructure, which came through stage 2 of that, they basically have owned the situation. We note in the documentary how they did this with Hong Kong, when they agreed to have this one country, 2 systems policy when Britain handed over Hong Kong to China, to mainland China. And of course, in Hong Kong, the Chinese regime has violated those agreements to a very large extent, which has led, more than 2 million Hong Kongers to take to the streets and protest. And we're seeing now where that's going, where, of course, because of this virus, the CCP appears to be again manipulating that to push its interests further in Hong Kong, while people cannot fight back. And of course, the final step is subjugation. The final step is the declaring victory over the full situation. How this ties into the Chinese regime saying it will not allow international investigators into its laboratories into China until they've achieved final victory over this virus. They can, of course, create false information, false evidence. They can create a Potemkin village, so to speak, where people go in and they're living in the Truman Show. When these investigators go in and everything they're encountering is, fake, manufactured. They can do that. The Chinese regime could set that up, and very likely would set that up in the meantime. Getting in there quickly, getting in there before they can do that is, of course, or should be at least, a priority of any country wanting to launch an international investigation. Senator Rick Scott is pledging to hold Communist China and WHO accountable for coronavirus fallout. And meanwhile, amidst this, China is backing the WHO to investigate the origin of this virus and is calling out the United States for politicizing this issue. This is according to South China Morning Post, which again it used to be more independent. They got bought up by, they're under Jack Ma now, Alibaba, and so not really trustworthy like they used to be. Again, they do sometimes act as a pseudo-mouthpiece of the Chinese regime. It says, quote, Maria von Kerkhove, an epidemiologist with the WHO, on Wednesday said the agency was in discussion with China about examining potential animal origins of the coronavirus. There is discussion with our counterparts in China for a further mission, which would be more academic in focus and really focus on looking at what happened at the beginning in terms of the exposures with different animals, so that we can look to have an approach to find a zootonic source. While the CCP is saying it will bar international investigators, it is saying it will allow the WHO in, possibly. Why is the WHO different from say, official international investigations? What is different between the WHO and other countries calling for investigations, not just the US, but for example, Australia, UK, other countries as well? What is different about the WHO that makes the CCP feel safe with them investigating it, but not other countries? Now, with that said, we'll end it here for tonight. Again, folks, we're going to be broadcasting Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, focusing very heavily on this new coronavirus. Next week, we should also be getting some great interviews. Chris Chappell from China Uncensored. I talked to him today. He said he's interested in coming on the show, so hopefully we'll get him on next week. Now, folks, again, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, we really need your support. And if you want to help, of course, we have 2 calls to action. One, we have launched an international petition. The Epoch Times has launched a global petition calling for the investigation, the condemnation, and the rejection of the Chinese Communist Party. You can go to ccpvirustruth.com to sign that petition. If you want to take it a step further, we're asking people, if they can, tell 5 friends or family about the petition. Help us get it out there. And of course, folks, we do take donations on this channel. I know it's rough times, and so we of course appreciate any support we can get. With that said, folks, stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you next time.